Good day, brothers and sisters in Christ. Welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to carry on with our Ezekiel Bible study, verse by verse, and we're going to look at chapter 8. But before we go any further, I'd like to just ask if you wouldn't mind subscribing to my channel and smashing the like button and sharing my video with as many family and friends as possible. And if you would like to leave a comment, I'd love to hear from you. So with that said, let's have a look at how Ezekiel chapter 8 is laid out, and we see just a brief overview here I've got. We see that it describes a vision that Ezekiel receives from God, revealing the abominations and idolatrous practices taking place in Jerusalem. And we see in chapter 1, Ezekiel's vision. Okay, and he's taken to Jerusalem, where he sees the glory of God. He is brought to the entrance of the temple, where he's shown various abominations committed by the people of Israel there. And then the idolatry of the temple. Ezekiel sees a series of idolatrous practices, including the image of jealousy at the entrance of the temple, which provokes God to anger, as we see in chapter 8, verse 5 and 6, a little later in my breaking down of chapter 8, in my verse by verse teaching. This symbolizes the people's turning away from true worship and their embrace of the false gods. And then there's also worship of idols. Ezekiel is showing more abominations, including the worship of various idols by the elders of Israel, who are depicted as offering incense and engaging in idolatrous rituals. This highlights the deep corruption of the spiritual unfaithfulness of the leaders of Israel. And then we're also going to have a look at the woman weeping for Tammuz. This chapter continues with the vision of woman weeping for Tammuz, a pagan deity associated with fidelity and agriculture. Okay, and we see that this practice reflects sarcasm and blending of the worship that had infiltrated the worship of Yahweh. So, and in the worship of the sun, finally Ezekiel sees men worshipping the sun at the temple entrance, turning their backs on the temple of the Lord and facing east and worshipping the sun. This act of idolatry further demonstrates the people's rejection of God and His commandments. So as we see, the overall message of chapter 8 serves as a powerful indictment to the idolatry and spiritual corruption present in Jerusalem at the time, revealing the depth of the people's unfaithfulness and the reasons for God's impending judgment. The chapter emphasizes the seriousness of turning away from true worship and the consequence that follows. So without anything else to do, let's have a breakdown of Ezekiel chapter 8 verses 1 to 18. The first portion is the abomination of the temple. Ezekiel goes to Jerusalem in a vision. And here we see in chapter 1, or verse 1, and it came to pass in the 6th year, in the 6th month, on the 5th day of the month, I sat in my house with the elders of Judah, sitting before me, that the hand of the Lord fell upon me there. So, this chapter begins with a series of visions, beginning in the 5th year of the king's reign of captivity. This is a new time maker describing visions that happen about a year and a half later. The series of visions takes us through Ezekiel chapters 8 to 11 and is recorded as one of the long visions. In the beginning of the vision, Ezekiel sees the glory of God at the temple of Jerusalem. But by the end of the vision, in chapters 10 and 11, we see that God's glory will depart. Okay, so here we see, and I sat in my house with the elders of Judah sitting before me. So here we see that this reminds us that Ezekiel is in his own house, and he is well respected enough as God's prophet to receive the elders of Judah in his house for an audience. Okay, so here Block says the reason for their presence in Ezekiel's house is not given, although chapter 14 and 20 suggest that they come to him and seek the word of Yahweh. Okay. So here we see the hand of the Lord fall upon me there. Just as before in Ezra 1 and 3, chapters 3, Ezekiel felt the presence and the strength of Yahweh upon him. And then in verses 2, waist and downwards. Then we move on to verses 2 and 4, where Ezekiel, in his vision, is transported to Jerusalem. Then I looked, and there was a likeness, like the appearance of fire, from the appearance of his waist and downwards, fire, and from his waist upwards, like the appearance of brightness, like the color of amber. He stretched out the form of a hand and took me by a lock of my hair, and the Spirit lifted me up between the earth and the heaven, and brought me in visions of God to Jerusalem, to the door of the north gate, of the inner court, where the seat of the image of jealousy was, which provokes to jealousy. And behold, the glory of the Lord, or the God of Israel, was there, like the vision that I saw in the plain. There was a likeness like the appearance of fire. Ezekiel saw something similar to the likeness he saw in the vision of God and His glory in the first chapter, Ezekiel 27. If we go back to that, that was the representation of God in some human likeness, and we could see same thing here. He stretched out the form of a hand. In Ezekiel's vision, something like a hand grabbed Ezekiel by the hand, and the Spirit carried him away between heaven and earth, bringing him to Jerusalem in a vision. So here we see Ezekiel had a spiritual vision of Jerusalem in the days when Jeremiah served as a prophet, in the period between the second invasion of the Babylonians and their final conquest of Jerusalem. Feinberg says here that, he quotes, he did not actually leave Babylon. He was carried back in the spirit to Babylon after the visions were completed. In this vision, Ezekiel saw 4 abominations at the temple. They were probably not literal in the sense that they were happening all at the same time at the temple, and Ezekiel saw in real time. God showed Ezekiel was what literally happened in both an outward and in a spiritual sense. So the first abomination was the outrageous idol associated with the king. Okay, then the images associated with the city leaders and the censors. Then there was the weeping over Tammuz associated with the women. Okay, and then lastly, this worship of the sun associated with the priests of the temple. To the north gate of the inner court. Specifically, Ezekiel came to the temple. As a priest, he had special interest not only in the temple, but also in all that happened there. Where the seat of the image of jealousy was, in his vision, Ezekiel apparently saw an idolatrous image, the image of jealousy, standing in the inner court. This was likely right outside the temple building itself. Taylor found this quote: "It was called the image of jealousy because it provokes to jealousy. In other words, it is an insult both to God and to His temple and to His people." In 2 Kings 18, we see that Hezekiah removed the idolatry from Judah, but his son Manasseh restored it and made it worse than ever before. even putting an idol into the temple. Manasseh's son Ammon then continued the state-sponsored idolatry of his father. And then King Josiah cleansed Judah of idolatry and burnt the idol Manasseh had put in the temple. Now we see that the idol in the temple was back. Okay. So that was just a brief history of the idol of jealousy. The word image, which occurs elsewhere only in Deuteronomy 4 verse 16, where it's translated figure, and in 2 Chronicles, is of a special idol set up by King Manasseh in the temple. Although the idol was later removed, Ezekiel's use of the word may mean that a replica, if not the original, was put back. The word also occurs in the Philemon writings, which is the secular writings of the day there. Behold, the glory of God of Israel was there. In his vision, Ezekiel saw the same glory of God that he saw in the plain. The glory of God was present at the temple of God in Jerusalem. There's a strong contrast between this glory and the debased idols and idolatry Ezekiel will see in the rest of this vision. God's glory has filled the tabernacle in Exodus 40, verses 34 to 35. And later, the temple, again, and the late temple in 1 Kings 8 verse 11. But by the end of this vision, in Ezekiel 10 and 11 chapters, the glory of the Lord will no longer dwell in the tabernacle. So here we see Ezekiel looks to the north, verse 5. Then he said to me, Son of man, lift your eyes now towards the north. So I lifted my eyes towards the north, and there, the north of the altar gate, was an image of jealousy in the entrance. Lift your eyes now towards the north. If one was standing at the entrance of the temple, the north would be on the right-hand side. We don't know which way Ezekiel had to turn, but he was directed to face the north or northward. North of the altar gate was the image of jealousy in the entrance. There again, Ezekiel saw this idol in the temple court. It was called the image of jealousy because it provoked God to holy jealousy. Then we see Taylor says the connection of this image to the north gate in verse 3 was significant, connecting this image of jealousy with royalty and the king. So he quotes here, this was the most honorable of the 3 gateways, because the royal palace being on the north side of the temple, the king would have used it whenever he went to worship. Okay. Verses 6 and 8. Great and greater abominations are shown to Ezekiel. Furthermore, he said to me, Son of man, do you see what they are doing? The great abomination that the house of Israel commits here, to make me go far away from my sanctuary. Now turn again, and you will see greater abominations. So he brought me to the door of the court, and when I looked, there was a hole in the wall. Then he said to me, Son of man, dig into the wall. And when I dug into the wall, there was a door. The great abominations of the house of Israel commits here. Ezekiel saw the image of jealousy, and God told him that it represented the great abomination of Israel. To make me go further away from my sanctuary, the idolatry was so persistent and offensive to God that it made him determined to go far away. It was his sanctuary belonging to God himself, but he would leave it because of the great abominations that were occurring there. Now turn again, and you will see greater abominations. What Ezekiel saw was bad enough. God now promised to show him even worse things, greater abominations. Son of man, dig into the wall to see these greater abominations. Ezekiel had to dig through a wall to see the vision, what was inside the temple itself. And here block in this quotation tells us, while we may puzzle over how he is able to dig a hole in the wall, or why he does not use the existing entrance into the room, the visionary nature of this entire unit removes the necessity of realism or logical consistency. So here we see now the spiritual application. This shows that it may take some effort of energy to truly see the interior, if only an easy or surface observation is allowed. The true state of things may not have been seen. Okay. So here we see the indication that this is deep idolatry, spiritual idolatry, and spiritual abandonment of God. What Ezekiel saw behind the wall, wicked things and blind men. This is verses 12 to 14. And he said to me, go in and see the wicked abominations which they are doing there. So I went and I saw, and there every sort of creeping thing, abominable beasts, and all the idols of the house of Israel portrayed all around the walls. And there stood before them 70 men of the elders of the house of Israel, and in their midst stood Zanahir, the son of Shaphan. Each man had a censer in his hand, and a thick cloud of incense went up. And he said to me, Son of man, you have seen what the elders of the house of Israel do in the dark, every man in the room of his idol. For they say, the Lord does not see us. The Lord has forsaken the land. That is such darkness of hearts, people. Even every sort of creeping thing, the abominable beasts, and all the idols. In his vision, Ezekiel saw the inside of the temple with all sorts of unclean and idolatrous things portrayed all around the walls. The interior of the temple was supposed to have cherubim surrounding God's throne, portrayed on the walls. Instead, it had filthy idols. And then God called these wicked abominations, and Paul quotes, the most abominable wickedness. They are loathsome in their nature and multiplied in number before me. And Feinberg says, the consensus of interpreters is that these were the animal cults of Egypt, as mentioned in Romans 1 verse 23, where Paul describes man's nature of rebellion and blindness to God. In Egypt, such worship had perhaps its highest and most extensive development in ancient times. Then Trapp also quotes, this piece of idolatry of the Jews they had learned from the Egyptians, who morally worshipped or madly worshipped oxen, asses, goats, dogs, cats, serpents, crocodiles, the bird, ibis, etc. There stood before them 70 elders of the house of Israel. In front of these foul and idolatrous images were the leaders of Israel, each with a censer, putting forth a thick cloud of incense. They offered priestly services that were given to Moses in the book of Leviticus, especially for Yahweh, these priestly services, and incense associated with praise in the midst of the idolatry and impurity. Block says here, the elders refers to the lay leaders who had risen to prominence in Jerusalem after the deportation of Jehoiakim and his officials. These were obviously important men in the city. Jasrahai, the son of Shaphan. Shaphan was probably to be identified with Josiah's Secretary of State. The Ahakan, another of Shaphan's sons, was an influential supporter of Jeremiah. Clearly, Josiah was the black sheep of a worthy family. So we're talking about the priestly family here. And one of the sons have fallen away and influenced all this pagan worship. Here we see, have you seen what the elders of the house of Israel do in the dark? Every man in his room of his idols. God showed Ezekiel that the vision was about what the leaders of Israel did in the dark and in the room of his idols. It wasn't about what the leaders did in the temple, okay? But the hidden places of their hearts were full with dark deeds and idolatry. yet they carried on their services as if all was right. Just like today, we may go worship publicly on a Sunday in the church and present things publicly, but in our hearts we carry those secret unconfessed sins and idolatries and those strongholds that we love to indulge in. So this is really speaking to the heart of man. Ezekiel was probably shocked to see what all these city leaders were, that they were secret idolaters. Feinberg says they had carried their idolatry to the temple and to their private homes. Public and private worship was permeated with God's dishonoring idolatry, and they were smugly compliant in all, compliments in all, while complicit in all. While the external rites of the temple of Jehovah were being observed, these very observances were made a cloak of the thoughts, the desires, the activities of the heart. This is the most helpless stage and stale of pollution. That's what Morgan quotes. Let's see what Meyer has to say in this quote. It is quite certain that the evil thoughts and imaginations have not imprinted themselves on the walls of the heart. It may be so. What seems fair and beautiful in the eye of man may be concealing terrible secrets open only to that of God. So here we can see that God can see straight through the heart of man, and he's repulsed and driven to abandonment of his own tabernacle here and his own temple. The Lord does not see us. The Lord has forsaken the land. So these priests and these pompous men that are there have excused their sin because they did not think Yahweh saw them. Either in their minds or in their actions. They also excused their sin because they believed God had forsaken Israel, when in fact they had forsaken God. Alexander quotes here, with this kind of rationalization, they permitted themselves to do anything they desired. If God did not exist, then no one need care about him. It is tragic that the same attitude exists today among so many people, as we could see in today's activities. Man's heart is as black as the pitch of darkness of night. What the man is in the dark room are saying about Yahweh is in fact false about him, but it is true of the images before which they stand. That's what Bloch quotes. Then in verses 13 and 14, the woman weeping for Tammuz, and he said to me, turn again, and you will see greater abominations that they are doing. So he brought me to the door of the north gate of the Lord's house, and to my dismay, women were sitting there weeping for Tammuz. With all you will see greater abominations. Ezekiel saw idolatry outside the temple and corruption among the leaders within. Yet there were greater abominations to see now. And Paul quotes, "We need not be perplexed, our readers, with the long discourse, to show wherein these latter sins are greater than the former mentioned. They are all very great. To my dismay, women were sitting there weeping for Tammuz." This is the only mention of Tammuz in Ezekiel and the Old Testament. This was another example of pagan worship, and Tammuz was the deity worshipped by many in the neighboring nations. Often with immoral and impure wives. Ezekiel was dismayed because the women were there in the holy place reserved only for priests, and because of their immoral idolatry. It is likely that the prophet would have viewed the presence of the woman in the inner court as profanation or profanity. The worship of Tammuz came from Babylon through the Phoenicians, the Canaanites. So we remember the account of Nimrod after the Tower of Babel and the nations were dispersed. This is where this false religion of Tammuz and his mother came from. And then the Greeks, Tammuz mentioned nowhere else in the scriptures, was the Babylonian Dumuzi, beloved of Ishtar, the son of Ishtar, and it is to be identified with the Greek Adonis. In the sensational mythological cycle, Tammuz dies early in the fall when vegetation withered. His rival by the wailing of Ishtar was marked by the buds of spring and the fertility of the land. Such renewal was encouraged and celebrated by licentious fertility festivals. This goes all the way back to the celebration of the pagan ritual of Easter. And there I have, if you go back in my videos, you will see the origins of Easter and the false gods. With the worship of this god in ancient times were connected to beasts, immoralities, or base moralities, with the greatest of abandonment of women, gave themselves up to the most shameful practices. Here is what Feinberg quotes. Verses 15 and 16, preachers or priests worshipping the sun. Then he said to me, "Have you seen this, O son of man? Turn again and you will see greater abominations than these." So he brought me into the inner court of the Lord's house, and there the door of the temple of the Lord Between the porch and the altar there were about 25 men with their backs towards the temple of the Lord, and their faces towards the east, and they were worshipping the sun towards the east. You will see greater abominations than these. God continually promised Ezekiel that he would see greater and greater abominations. This time his vision would display them in the inner court of the Lord's house, Yahweh's house. And Rebus says here, in this quote, the idolatry of the 70 elders was hidden in the temple, but these men practiced their idolatry openly. About 25 men with their backs towards the temple, and they were worshipping the sun towards the east. These men stood there, or stood where the priests would normally stand and bless the people. Yet, with the temple behind them and the altar before them, their faces were turned towards the east. They were worshipping the sun towards the east. The sun god, Ra, from Egyptian mythology, and also it can go right down to the false gods of all the Middle Eastern origins of their religions. They don't worship Yahweh. Even at his own temple, they worship the sun, as the other pagan nations did. The number and the location of these men make it likely, though not certain, they were priests. Okay. These worshippers showed their contentment of God by standing in such a way that their backs to the temple while they were reverenced to the sun, worshipping the creature rather than the Creator, as we see in Romans 1 verses 25. Then we go on to verses 17 and 18, a promise of judgment upon all these abominations. And he said to me, have you seen this, O Son of Man? It is a trivial thing to the house of Judah to commit the abominations which they have committed here. For they have filled the land with violence. They have returned to provoke me to anger. Indeed, they have put the branch of their nose. Therefore, I will act in fury. My eyes will not spare, nor will I have pity. And though they cry in my ears with a loud voice, I will not hear them. It is a trivial thing to the house of Judah to commit abominations. In his vision of the temple, Ezekiel saw a terrible variety of idolatries and abominations. The leaders and the people of Jerusalem regarded it all as a trivial thing, but God did not, for they filled the land with violence. These were not only religious or spiritual sins, they rejected Yahweh and his true worship, led to the breakdown of social order. Smith says the inhabitants of Judah were not content to provoke the Lord with their abominations. They also filled the land with violence. In other words, in the social arena, there was chaos and injustice. Indeed, they put the branch to their nose. This is an unusual statement, used only here in the Old Testament. It was some obscure expression of contentment for God. Feinberg says this phrase, put the branch to their nose, is obscure. Jewish commentators understand it to refer to some revolting and wicked rite. If it was a ritual act of idolatrous occult, then it is grave indeed, but not such ritual act is known amongst Semitic peoples. Some take it to be a gesture of contempt towards God. That's what Feinberg says there. And then Wright had another idea. He quotes, the branch held to the nose may have been an intimidation of the Egyptian Anak, a symbol of life, which is shown in carvings as held to the nose, or it may have been connected with plants sacred to Tammuz or other gods. Okay. Walter and Harp also argue that the text has been corrupted. Okay. A branch in my nose, all that the Lord is saying is that in place of a pleasing odor and honest sacrificial worship to God, God is receiving from the Israelites, a stench that reaches his nostrils. Okay. My eyes will not spare, nor will I have pity, because of the great idolatries and sin of Jerusalem, and that the people regard it all as a trivial thing. God's judgment was assured and could not be turned back. And Morgan says, because of this utter corruption of the people, Jehovah would proceed in judgment, in spite all the loud crying of the people. And Block quotes, Yahweh hereby affirms that from now on his ears are closed to all pleas of mercy. He will not allow his heart to overrule his head. Folks, this is just such an amazing chapter in Ezekiel. It reflects a holy God loving the worship of his people, but his people have turned it into an abomination by bringing in pagan abominations and cultural rituals and serving false gods and deities that represent an abomination to Yahweh. And it's so familiar in today as we see all that is happening in the world today. We are turning back to the false gods and worshipping them as we could see in the Olympic Games opening and closing ceremonies, folks. And as we reflect on this chapter 8 of Ezekiel, we have to bear in mind that God has set out a judgment for this world, and it's not going to stop. He has decreed that this behavior He will not tolerate. This rejection of Him He will not tolerate. And He will bring a judgment to this earth that none of us can even imagine, as Revelation describes. Folks, may I ask you, as we reflect and ponder, may we keep in prayer our loved ones who do not know the Lord. We pray to save the souls of the lost, so that they are not condemned to a Christless eternity in hell. Brothers and sisters in Christ, we will chat again in chapter 9 as we move into the next chapter of Ezekiel. Have a blessed week.